Hi, this is John Quinlan. Welcome to Forward Forum. My guest today is Neil Heinen. He is currently the editorial director of WISC-TV, also plays a similar role with Madison Magazine. He's been with WISC since 1987, originally an assignment editor, and transitioning into that editorial director role. He's one of a handful of people that still do these amazing 50, 70-second editorials at the end of newscasts that just capture and distill down the essence of an issue. And done some thrilling things over the years and been privileged to work with him on a few of those efforts. There's so much to talk about here. We'll be talking about the scope of Neil's life and also talking about current events that are affecting Madison, especially struggles for racial justice. Hey, Neil Heinen, welcome to Forward Forum.
Thank you, John.
So great.
What an interesting experience.
Yeah, isn't it interesting being on the other side?
Yeah.
I told you I got to do an oral history interview where people were interviewing me for a change after about 1,000 hours of radio. Oh, that's a different experience.
Yeah.
So this will be fun.
I don't know who else could do this. So
thank you. Well, it's great to have you here. Well, I want to again get to some of the scope of what makes you tick. What has motivated you to do your work in journalism. Again, actually, let's just start with that fact that you are one of a handful of people doing these editorials at this point. What's the power in being able to convey the kind of messages you convey in your editorials?
Yeah, I still think there is power to it, John.
Yeah.
Even though most people in the industry no longer agree for any variety of reasons that it's not a good idea. Really going back to the start of this conversation around 1990, 91, was a time of really great change in the industry. Things were good. Television stations were making a lot of money, and they were looking to expand their services and what they did. And when I started at WIBA, at Channel 3, WISC-TV, in 1987, I think it was the following year that Tom Beers served as president of the Radio Television News Directors Association.
Yeah.
And so Tom was really involved in sort of this national conversation about the future of broadcast and the growth of local broadcast in particular. And Tom was foreseeing the advent of morning news, of which there was none at the time. Really? Expanded weekend coverage, adding earlier shows when there was just a 10 o'clock news typically on Saturday or Sunday, if then. Off-hour times that we're now so familiar with, 9 o'clock news, 10 o'clock in the morning news. And so Tom started to plot out how we were going to expand our coverage. But he also, at that time, said that he was interested in doing editorials.
Yeah. Because
he felt it was part of a local broadcaster's responsibility to offer opinion and commentary, kinds of things. And it was at the exact time that the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, was doing away with the Fairness Doctrine.
Yeah.
And did away with it almost entirely. Eventually, they did do away with it entirely, but at the time, almost entirely, to eliminate the requirement that stations do certain things in the public interest, convenience, and necessity, as the arcane language went. But they did, and a lot of stations took that opportunity to stop doing editorials. At the time, there were hundreds of television stations doing editorials.
Right.
All the network O&Os were required to do them by the networks, and so all the CBS, NBC, ABC affiliates did them. And slowly they stopped doing them, and we started in 1992 when our owner Liz Burns had put the trust and faith in Tom and me, and said, "Yeah, let's go ahead and do it."
Is there maybe something special about the communities that still do these? Because when I was down in Montgomery and Selma, I think it's Channel 12 in Montgomery, still does the editorials. Mm-hmm. What a weekend! The 50th anniversary of the March, to put in perspective the events that were playing out that weekend. And it just wouldn't have, the broadcasts were amazing, and they went and did live news all weekend long. Yeah. But I think the editorials were sort of the icing on the cake, tying up the package. I don't know how you want to describe it, but they put in context everything that happened. Is that part of what you tried to do?
Sure, and I think to respond to your question, there are probably two kind of components to it. One is the relationship between the station owner and the station manager or general manager, because in most cases now it's the general manager who delivers the editorial.
Yep.
There are very few full-time editorial directors. my colleague Chuck Stokes at WXYZ in Detroit, which is the ABC affiliate in Detroit, has a job very much like mine, does 3 or 4 editorials a week and an hour-long public affairs show on the weekends. But that company and the general managers there so value Chuck's role in the community and the role that the editorials play in the community. In other places, like Selma, I would suggest is that the general manager is probably delivering the editorial.
I think that was the case, yeah.
And this is the relationship between the general manager and the community. You know, between the station and the people that station serves. And I think that's really special. There are a lot of general managers who do editorials occasionally.
Yeah.
I think at least 2 of the 4 stations in Milwaukee, the general manager will do them there occasionally. One, there's an anchor who does them. It's sort of a pseudo commentary editorial.
Right.
But I still really value the opportunity to deliver a formal institutional editorial, the opinion of WISC-TV's management. Not mine, which is hard for some people to understand since I'm standing there delivering it. And to be fair, I write them. I propose most of them. And the editorial board does not put me in a position of doing an editorial that I do not believe in.
Yeah.
And we've had we've actually had to have some agreements about it.
You told me in the past your editorial board is probably a little bit more conservative than you are.
You know, slightly, and it changes as people come
people
and go.
don't belong as points on a spectrum from conservative to liberal anyway.
Well, and so let's just take the death penalty, for example.
Right.
I don't know that the death penalty necessarily breaks down evenly along political ideological lines.
Reproductive rights, I think, are much more nuanced than people will assume.
They are, and that I feel comfortable saying that when Liz entrusted me with editorials, she did ask me not to deal with abortion. It's the only thing.
Interesting.
And I don't know why, John. It could be as simple as wanting the station not to be in the middle of a really emotional, tough conversation like that.
Yeah.
But for the death penalty, I'm unalterably opposed to the death penalty. There are some members of my board who feel that under certain circumstances, they just could see the death penalty being an appropriate end game. And I can't. And so I've asked them not to put me in a position of even saying it's sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Yeah. What's your favorite kind of editorial to do? I guess one thing that comes to mind is you do such wonderful tributes. When I got the King Award, which you received also, I mean, no other tribute was as special. And it was partly because you were kind enough to say, hey, we're kind of proud of this guy because we sort of consider him to be a part of the family. And whoa, that felt pretty good. But I know lots of other folks that you know, again, in this pithy 70-second, 5 or 6 short declarative sentences, you just pack a lot into that. But I think the tributes you do to people are just really very special.
Yeah. And they can be touchy. I mean, I've tried to occasionally honor someone who was nearing the end of their life and wanting to do it before the end of their life, instead of waiting until after. And just in the event that it might mean something to them. In some cases, that's not possible. We just recently lost the incomparable Maureen Arcand.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. She passed away 3 or 4 weeks ago, John.
Yeah.
While you were gone, and there was virtually no mention of it. I saw the obituary in the paper, and I thought, holy smokes! Here's a woman who lived to be, I believe, 82, maybe more, but she was in her 80s.
Yeah. And
had been diagnosed with cerebral palsy in her 20s, and was told at the time, maybe 5, 6, 7, 10 years at the most.
Right.
And she was, she had made such an impact on my life, but such an impact on so many people's lives in Dane County. She was on the Dane County board. She was on any number of commissions and committees, and was a fierce advocate.
I think Maureen and Jim Wright were 2 of the most important people to me early in my activist time. Yeah.
So anyway, to be able to do an editorial like that does really give me joy. Yeah. I got to tell you, I don't mind making people uncomfortable either. You know, I mean, provoking thought, provoking conversation around an issue?
Well, so
you know what that's all about.
I do, and I was telling you, this has been a tough several months for me. I think, especially as Tony Robbins has played out, but the build up to it, maybe going back at least to Alex G's amazing editorial about what it was like to speak before Madison Rotary, to have someone come up and say, "Hey, we're glad you're not an angry black man," and not understand all the layers, which that is wrong. I editorialized about this in the Cap Times while I was down in Selma. It was just about 5 days after Tony Robinson was shot. That it is frustrating, in my 36-year experience in Madison, to constantly be confronted with levels of denial, levels of, "Oh, I'm sorry, we're not comfortable talking about this anymore," a sense of wanting to put closure on things that, unfortunately, I think folks out of majority culture understand take decades to resolve, being ahistorical. Anyway, there is this Madison thing. As proud as I am of this place, I wouldn't have stayed here for 36 years. There is a flip side that does not understand it's a tale of two cities, economically, racially, in so many other ways. That for every wonderful Money Magazine award we get, there are people who don't have that experience. And we spend a lot of time kind of obfuscating and working around things instead of working through them. Those are the editorials I especially enjoy from you because you go right at it. You're spot on about that. When you put those editorials, do you get pushback? Is it hard to be that kind of truth speaker and get at those realities?
Well, there's levels of pushback.
Okay.
There's the comments on the website that I don't.
It's amazing how courageous people can be when they're totally anonymous.
Which I don't read.
Right.
John. So I know they're there. I mean, sometimes people will tell me that they're there. I don't pay any attention to them. Then there's always the humbling pushback from people who know more than I do, and who I think I'm perhaps trying to include in the conversation, who point out very clearly and accurately where I'm not.
Yeah.
And that's great. I mean, because that leads to more editorials, and that leads to a richer dialogue. But I'm with you. I mean, this Madison that we live in today feels very different to me than it ever has in my 40-some years of living here, and it conflicts with the Madison that I feel I have great affection for and feel can be a terrific city.
Looking at your interview with Paul Soggin, the post-mayoral race, he made a point of how much the city has changed in 10 years. To a certain extent, I think that's true. But I think of when we launched the Fair Housing Council in the 80s. I'm sorry, I feel like we've gone full circle. I feel like this stuff has been around for a long time. And folks do not want to believe that 1 out of 3 African-American applicants for housing were having significant differential treatment. Northern style, they don't say it to your face, but they charge you more rent, show you different apartments, discourage you from being there. Right. This is a case in point. We just had so much of a battle. Oh, this couldn't be happening in Madison. We solved these problems in the 60s. The level of denial was there. But the other thing is, yes, Madison has become more diverse demographically. Our first grade class now is majority minority. I mean, so those realities are there, and I think we need to mark that. But Madison's always been diverse. It's just that some voices have been heard and others have been rendered invisible. Mm-hmm. And so I think what's happening now is not so much that anything new is on the horizon, but we're putting a spotlight on it, and folks like Young, Gifted, and Black, but also a full range of leaders in different minority communities, disenfranchised communities, are not letting it pass. Every other time, it seems like the debate would be open, it would be there for a few weeks, and then it would kind of pass. I don't think it's going to pass this time. I think that's a good thing.
I think it's a very good thing, and I don't think it's going to pass either. I mean, I feel a momentum that I haven't felt before. I think I'm hearing a more nuanced conversation than what I've heard before. But I also am worried, you rightfully point to 20, 25 years ago, and we hear that a lot from our African-American brothers and sisters, that this is not new. I mean, this is an old conversation for them, and there has been very little change, and in some cases regression. I think I would argue regression. I don't know if they would agree with that. And so I'm a little worried that our ability to resist change in such subtle ways can work to dampen to hold the conversation down and to prevent authentic change from occurring.
And I think it's important to define that word subtle. We used that word again in 1984 or 5 when the Equal Rights Division did these surveys of the prevalence of housing discrimination. The city where you just would not guess that was there. But subtle doesn't mean real. It just means it's hidden. It's again, it's obfuscated. In the South, there's a certain part of the reason why I think I felt a little strange coming back to Madison post Tony Robinson is in the South, things are on the table, and the folks that are still living in Jim Crow era in terms of their thinking, they're going to let you know what they think. But there's not sort of this level of liberal denial. There's not a level of, I think things are fine, or some of my best friends are, speaking, or thinking about it entirely in the realm of the individual and not understanding institutional stuff. In some ways, because things are more out in the open there, they get it in a way that we don't necessarily get in the North or in Madison, Wisconsin.
Right. This just popped into my head because I've been thinking about cities and how we've been talking about cities for the last 10 years and how some of that thinking has, I think, created an environment in which the disparities that we're seeing in Madison can exist.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's very important. We have to rethink some of that. There's the institutional stuff that has to change, whether it's how we think about the relationship between law enforcement and the African American community in particular. But if we're going to talk about immigration reform, I mean, there are a lot of issues.
And it was interesting how Paul Sognum put that front and center about this last election, immigration.
Yep.
Yeah.
These affect the relationships between institutions and segments of our community that I think result in some of the disparities. So driver's education and making it available and inexpensive.
I didn't even realize that driver's education had gone away. What a horrible thing.
We of a certain age, I think, don't think about
it's not horrible if you're middle class, so you can afford to buy it privately for your kids, but what about all the other kids that don't have access to a car now?
And pot fines and a lot of the things that are on the table now. But then the third thing that I think is even the hardest and gets to what I think you're talking about. And I give credit to Jen Cheatham for thinking this through and putting it on the table.
Madison Superintendent of Schools for about 2 years now.
Yep. And that's now at this stage of her strategic plan, thinking ahead to the child that's going to graduate 18 years from now.
Yeah.
What do we expect of that child? What do we want for that child? And this is every child. And so thinking through that, what at the age of 2 or 3 do we think of that child, provide for that child going into school? And that's an attitudinal change, John, that I worry about Madison's ability to accomplish without significant work.
Yeah.
That we still look at kids of color differently than we look at white kids from the beginning.
Right.
And that if we were really to authentically change that, genuinely change that perception, it would affect how we think in terms of resources and environment and culture, and begin to make a change that ultimately results in fewer or no Tony Robinsons.
And you're hitting the nail on the head. I think so much of, again, the kind of duplicity or the liberal facade, that manifests sometimes is the asterisk that put people, well, I believe that everybody has the same, should have the same opportunities and all the rest of the stuff, but not understanding how it's not a level playing field from the get-go. And, working at Center for Families a couple of years ago, you did a great editorial for us there. We got at, hey, it's got to start at ages 1, 2, and 3. It's got to start in all of our different communities. And we have to stop obsessing on somehow there's something inherently wrong with African American families, for example, and instead bolster up the parents, the extended family members, the other people who are there. But we also have to deal with early childhood education, so many things. But focusing on Tony Robinson, one of the discouraging things is all of the analysis has been around about how screwed up this kid was and how messed up he was, and therefore somehow that's a justification for what happened to him. I'm sorry, there's a double standard here, because I don't think that a 19-year-old white middle-class kid would be judged in the same way. I think consciously or otherwise, we put all of these expectations on a 19-year-old black man. All of the images in the movies, all the negative news coverage, all that just all kind of channels it into somehow it was his fault. And it wasn't his fault. He was a 19-year-old white kid. We would have said 19-year-olds stumble and they struggle and they do all kinds of things, but hey, he's a good kid at the core.
Well, and there more likely would have been intervention too.
And there would have been intervention, right. And that's the other key thing.
More likely, not always, more likely.
So I'll stop editorializing, but just when I was in the ground, in Selma, I heard the news of Tony Robbins' death. It was a breakfast for the foot soldiers of the 65 March, people who were teenagers and in their early 20s in 1965, speaking to the same group today. From the stage, gentlemen asked for a moment of silence. But of course, Tony Robinson is one of dozens upon dozens of young African-American men who've been part of the same syndrome in this country. The thread, I think, that we haven't quite identified yet is most of those young men were in some kind of agitated state. They were acting in ways they didn't usually act because of maybe an addiction problem, because of untreated mental health. But you're exactly right, Neil. At the root of that is the fact that we don't have culturally competent mental health system care. If you talking to Joe Ballas a while back, if you have a heroin addiction, it's one thing if you're upper middle class or middle class. You have access to treatment resources that folks in low-income communities and racial minority communities don't have. So it all comes back to, again, instead of pointing fingers and blaming a whole group of people that there's somehow something flawed in them, we got to understand the flaws in our society that allows these disparities to exist.
I need to be so careful all the time not to overgeneralize, because as an editorial writer, I'm prone to do that.
Sure.
But I was introduced to the concept of trauma and growing up in trauma by Cheryl Cato during a recent children's task force meeting that we had at Channel 3. Yeah. I mean, just not that we don't have our own ideas of trauma, but the idea that it is a constant fact of life for people who are very poor, for people who are struggling every day, for people who are living in neighborhoods where there is more crime, or there are no grocery stores, or it is a tougher place to live. It adds an element to living that a lot of us don't think about. And that's not every person of color, it's not every neighborhood, but it is a real part of daily life in some places.
Yeah.
And we see some behaviors for which we never allow that thought to enter our minds, that that's a contributing factor. And it is.
And when we have this rhetoric that we're in a post-racial age, or when we need to be colorblind, or Black lives versus all lives matter, all that thing obfuscates the fact that if you are a person of color in American society today, this is not something of the distant past. It's not the 150-year ago legacy of racism and slavery. It is something that is still manifest in the here and now. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I think trauma is at the root, not just for people of color, but for all of us. We are, by our very nature as human beings, we are susceptible to trauma. And if we weren't susceptible to it, we would be horrible people, because we wouldn't be sensitive and open and compassionate and open-minded. But we tend to, again, gloss over the effect that difficult circumstances have on someone. Obviously, there are folks that transform and transcend those dynamics. We don't want to stigmatize them. We should talk about Nancy's activism, in the realm of mental health that epitomizes that. But yeah, if we're, again, I think that the central dilemma in Madison, Wisconsin is we don't understand what it is to grow up in a community where you're stigmatized, where you're put down, where you don't have role models in the schools in terms of teachers, where there is this unconscious bias. Barbara Golden, who her family socioeconomically was quite well off, but racism affected her kids in the way that they thought of themselves.
I'm trying. I'm a 63-year-old white guy trying to come to grips with this stuff.
We need you.
Well, but it's true. I mean, that's
right.
I feel more comfortable talking about this stuff knowing that people who are smarter than me and more experienced than me will tell me where I can shift my thinking a little bit. But I do feel like I need to own some of this stuff and add it to the conversation.
I think that's true, but I think we also, white guilt has many manifestations. What we can't do is somehow think that we don't have a role, that we shouldn't have a voice. What you do in reviewing your recent shows, too, I like to think I do this, too. I think it's one of the reasons we both got the King Award, is we're bringing voices to the table who aren't heard in traditional media or in other societal settings. And being a catalyst for allowing other people to have a voice is probably one of the most important things you can do.
I agree.
So thinking back to a recent interview, you had on M. Adams and Brandy Grayson, who this was a February interview. This is before Tony Robinson. It was interesting because I thought it was after Tony Robinson because the themes that they were stressing about the disproportionate incarceration of black men in this
important,
county.
John. A lot of people who are supporting the activist young people's movement as part of all this really want to point out that this precedes
absolutely
Tony Robinson. It goes back to Ferguson and probably for some of them before, but.
Well, and again, from my mind, it goes back to the day I moved to Madison that I realized that there were disparities, that there were a couple of different cities here. Again, I think sometimes, we're going to say, West Siders don't go to the East Side. Sometimes we are so parochial in our view of things, and Dave Dahmer made a great point that, he and John Gramling are sometimes the only white people or the only people outside the South Side neighborhoods that go to the festivals and stuff. So much of it is opening up ourselves to new experiences. My goodness, we travel, across the country and around the world, but sometimes when we get to the other side of town, is that part of what you try to do?
I'm terrible at it.
Well, you are, but I think you're at least trying.
Yeah, but I don't get to Juneteenth as much as I would like.
Okay.
I don't get to some of the other celebrations because I get caught in just the daily life in my little world, and don't put forth the effort sometimes that would expand that world. Now I get opportunities to do things in other ways, and I'm appreciative for that. But it's something that I think we all need to do better at.
There was a Facebook dialogue. A friend of mine who's on the county board just put out the candid thing. She's a candid observation. Gosh, I really don't have many black friends. I did back in college, but I don't now. And I hang tight with my family and my neighborhood and all the rest of the stuff. And it was interesting because what precipitated off of that were 20 other or 30 other comments kind of similar. Just, well, gosh, I guess I should, but I just get so caught up in the day to day. And a bunch of us just finally weighed in and said, I'm sorry, this is central. You are a part of the problem if you're not being proactive about reaching out, about engaging in things. And the rationales were pointed, well, Madison just isn't a very diverse place. I'm sorry, we have more foreign students here than any other campus besides Harvard. We have ample opportunities in terms of festivals and arts programming and other things. You just have to seek it out. And it's not that hard to find. So you're saying, sometimes in your editorials you come down hard on people, and I hate to be a naysayer. I love this place, and there are counter examples to everything that I'm citing here. But until we deal with the horrible realities of the ways that we segregate off people, that we judge them, that we don't understand them, we just can't get anywhere.
Well, and if I can juggle my hats here, I do want to say that at Madison Magazine, we are trying, and we can do it because it's a different environment. The monthly environment from the daily environment is so different. But I see value in continuing to define diversity as broadly as we can, because I think when we look at something like Accessible Madison and how this city is for people with various disabilities, it does say something about other disparities.
Right.
When we look at the Hmong community and the Hmong community's history here, as we did in the most recent Madison Magazine, fascinating, recent for some of us, but it's 25 years, looking at how that culture has thrived or not thrived here, tells us something about how the diversities that we're dealing with on some more transparent levels. And I think we have to constantly push ourselves to look at that diversity that we all know is critical to life in Greater Madison.
Dave Obey spoke at the United Nations Association meeting. It was a tribute to George McGovern, but one of the interesting tangents he went off on was to talk about when Wausau suddenly had a large number of Hmong immigrants, probably as many as a third of the kids in school were Hmong, in a city that was once jokingly called the whitest city in America. Having grown up there, I understand, why people would think that. But there was a very conscious, thoughtful effort, and a lot of it involved Dave's staff. Dave was my neighbor, by the way, growing up, so I can call him Dave, I guess. But he, they brought in examples of the best of culture, music, and dance. They created dinners and other places where people could talk. It's not all that strange an experience in Wisconsin that many of us are the children of immigrants, that we have a similar experience in terms of, juxtaposing our life, in another place with our life here. Somehow that connection was made in a way that made it possible for them to become part of the fabric of the community. It doesn't mean it's some kind of homogenous, gray, out, everybody the same type fabric, this gloriously diverse tapestry.
Right.
We're doing that sort of hit and miss here, but I think that is the kind of model we got to pursue.
Well, maybe melting pot has sort of
it's a horrible term,
old-fashioned and misleading connotation for some. But I've written about this, John, and I'm struck by it. It came from Carlo Petrini, the man who started Slow Food in Italy 25 years ago, and Petrini thinking with food as a metaphor. And to me, it is a powerful metaphor, particularly through the lens of slow food, good, clean, and fair. But the idea that monocultures are deadly, that they planting all corn destroys the land for anything else.
Exactly.
And that's true for so many things in the biological ecosystem, that only through diversity can ecosystems survive and thrive and nurture themselves. And to me, it's not a leap to look at this through a political lens and realize that in some political ideologies, diversity is seen as a threat. It's seen as something that is not desirable because monocultures are somehow more reassuring. They're more comfortable, and in some cases more lucrative up to a point where they don't become lucrative any longer, and then you have to find a different monoculture. But that's a part of us that I think has changed over 20, 30 years, and it's weird because as the world gets smaller and the world gets more diverse, we struggle with these impulses towards a comfort level with a certain brand, with a certain way of doing things that begins to create fear, distrust, greed, and envy in some cases where diversity is seen as a threat.
There's 1,000 different directions I want to go off everything as you said, but I think in two strains. One is food, also diversity. Let me come back to food in just a second, but one of the things we've talked a lot about, and hopefully maybe at some point I'll be able to write about this, in your magazine, is especially since I've been involved with the United Nations Association, the lens through which I view Madison is increasingly an understanding that we are this coming together place of so many international traditions. Most recently, on this set, talking to Krishna Pradhan and Joe Elder about all the intersections with Madison and Nepal. I was telling Krishna, when I had been out in New York a couple months before at the UN, I was trying to describe this to someone in Madison, Wisconsin. And I think the fact I could say that we have roughly 8 Indian restaurants and probably even more Thai restaurants is one thing. But the fact that we have a Nepali restaurant, it was one of the first in the country, that kind of trumps it right there. So this is the transition, I guess, back into food. Food and breaking bread together and understanding diverse cultures, that's so important. The other aspect, I think, of homogenous, everybody thinking alike and being alike type thing, again, you have to understand this is a horrible strain in American culture. The melting pot notion also translated into a eugenics movement where people with disabilities, especially emotional disabilities, they're trying to weed people out of the population. How wrong-headed that was. The notion of cognitive diversity, people thinking differently. Bring two of those strains together. Your wife Nancy, when she ran the Wilson Street Grill, realized, first of all, this was a great gathering place for all kinds of different causes and people to come together. But a majority of her employees were people with disabilities, emotional disabilities. Yep. Where did she come to that conclusion, and how did that work?
I mean, and it is truly an inspiration for me, and
yeah.
It always has been. It originated, when Nancy and her partner Andrea Craig started the Wilson Street Grill. Their desire to create a neighborhood restaurant in a location that had never accommodated a neighborhood restaurant, despite its many efforts at doing so. The Library Lounge and the Green Dragon,
yep,
and I mean, there were 3 or 4 places, none of which made it. So they wanted to open it up, and they wanted it to be a place where people who lived and worked downtown felt comfortable being there. And Nancy just simply thought, I want the workforce to represent the community that's going to be coming here. And she had a particular interest in employing people with disabilities. And as soon as she did, and her approach was very organic. I mean, she hadn't had any training in it, hadn't studied it. She just knew that she wanted to make it possible for people with disabilities to enjoy the work experience and to feel successful at what they did. So she, I think, started doing things that weren't even being talked about at the time, like job carving and finding the one job that somebody can do well, letting them do it well, and then letting them move on to something else. If they were too sick to come in one day, having alternative plans where that would not be a problem for the workforce. And what happened, John, and the important part of all of this, is that it created an environment in which everybody wanted to work.
Yeah.
So you had your so-called able employees who not only felt a sense of relationship that they hadn't felt before, but they felt enabled to talk about their own perceived or real disabilities.
My sense of talking to people was more than a workplace.
Yeah.
It was a social, a sense of community that surrounded
and
everything.
And it does. I mean, to me, it is part of that diversity ecosystem in which true growth can occur, in which good things can happen.
Well, one of the reasons I have some optimism about racial justice is as a gay man. I remember 1986 when I came out. I remember speaking before a common council that the majority of folks didn't get it. We were trying to do an alternative family ordinance at the time, which was kind of a silly name for it because we weren't alternative at all. We were more traditional probably than most families. But this notion of once you engage with someone, get to know them. Breaking bread is part of that. Going to someone else's neighborhood is part of that. There's a sea change. Madison, Wisconsin, even more than San Francisco and Oakland or all the so-called gay enclaves throughout the country, has had more openly lesbian and gay elected officials. Of course, we've got a U.S. senator and a House member that nobody else has. Yeah. I'm awfully proud of that. But that happened not just because LGBT community members engaged, but because allies put themselves in our shoes. They realized we were their family members and their friends and their coworkers, and they stood up for us. And we've got to have a similar sea change that occurs in terms of racial diversity.
Yeah, we do. And, I so hope that the promise of globalism can add to the diversity conversation. I love your description of Madison, and can the population of the university even be brought to bear even more?
You got to break down that wall between university and community, which is still really profound.
Because I think there are people from around the world coming here who value their experiences here, who would look at the disparities with which we're wrestling.
They do.
And say, yeah, I understand that. And here are some things that will work. And here are some things that we can change.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is what we need. I mean, to look at the criminal justice system and the criminal justice system in so many other countries are models by which we could learn a lot. Just to take that one little piece of the disparities.
Two people I communicated in the last week, around United Nations Association things. My co-chair on an LGBT international issues group that we just formed Septina is an ally. She grew up in Sierra Leone in Nigeria. Her family moved to North Carolina, I believe, when she was in high school. So here's the distinction I would make. There is American exceptionalism, which I think is a horribly destructive force because it makes us think that we have nothing to learn from the rest of the world, versus the exceptional possibilities that immigrants to this country see. So they know that things are broken and that dots aren't being connected and relationships aren't being formed, but they're working here because we're not a melting pot. We're a diverse salad. We are a stew in which minority people like Hmong and Native American people in Wisconsin, they only be 50,000 people out of 5 million, but they're the spice in the stew that makes life worth living, makes it exciting and vibrant. So I think people of color and people who are new to this country get that. Those of us who've been around for a while, we've got to be kind of shaken out of our complacency and realize change could be good. It could add all kinds of new dimensions to our life.
I totally agree. And there are examples around the world. And Toronto, I think, is a very, very good one.
Oh, it's an excellent
example. As I think about urban places and what we want Madison to become, which was one of the things you started this conversation with, John. What is it about Madison, Wisconsin? Well, Toronto's not a bad example.
Yeah, and I think, the Torontos of the world. Actually, another thing is, a mantra, Madison is not Ferguson or Madison is not Baltimore. Well, let's be a little cautious about that. In the Ferguson case, let's understand that all of those things that Attorney General Holder uncovered about the reasons why people were going to jail. I think in their case, there was a group of people exploiting the black population. Not sure that's happening here, but the effect has been the same. People are going to jail because they're poor and can't afford bail, or because they have lots of fines, or because of other things. And people of color are way out of proportion to the white folks, especially economically privileged white folks. And so there is a lesson we can learn from a Ferguson. Having just spent most of last week out in Washington and Baltimore area, I think what we miss about Baltimore is, despite all the challenges they're facing and the isolated looting and violence that's occurring, it's occurring in a community that's facing what most large urban centers are facing because of lack of resources and other things. They're really a problem with American society and our priorities. But in the midst of that, there is amazing community organizing happening, amazing ways in which people are being brought together. There was this story about, a mother and son. The son was a 16-year-old thinking, hey, I'm going to get out on the street and I'm going to make a ruckus and I'm going to do all of this. And mom was there saying, no, you aren't. Not in my community. You're not going to do everything I did. Yeah, and again, maybe that falls into some other stereotypes, but at base, that's something we can all identify with. But that's not something we assume. We assume the worst of urban environments and in other places. We've got to start assuming the best. It's just off of that, spending time with Malele on Sunday as she was coming out of the hospital, and thank God she's okay. I remember you citing this, on one of the shows you did, the strengths of a magazine like Umoja. So we have to have you on for a few more hours later, but one of the things I did want to explore with you is, again, the need for a look at race in media and the need for diverse newsrooms. But to start with Malele and Umoja, this good news newsletter that talks about all the great things that are happening in the African American community, what are the challenges or what are the barriers for the rest of the news media also embracing that ethos?
Well, you start with the diversity in the building, John. I mean, there's just really no way around it. If the voices are not in the building, if the conscience is not in the building, it's way too easy to miss opportunities at diversity. And there are different ways to do that. And using Madison Magazine as an example, we don't have a lot of people of color on the staff, but we have a lot of people of color in the family. Our a lot of people we work with are married to people of color or have kids of color, and so that influence comes in. But Malele, that Umoja is a remarkable publication, and it has just gotten better and better and better over the years. And I think it's indispensable. I can't imagine a journalist not needing Umoja as one of the tools, of our jobs. The diversity of the community it covers, to overuse a word, is so helpful in identifying people that are just doing remarkable things. And then Mullaley's spirit, that philosophy of success and celebrating achievement and accomplishment.
And we should mention 25th anniversary is being celebrated over Umoja. There'll be a special exhibition down at the municipal building.
Right.
It's kicking off with the ceremony on Wednesday.
I mean, Mullaley's changed how I think about sports.
Yeah.
You know, I look at athletics differently from constantly reading Mullaley's challenge to not glorify the athlete at the expense of the student, at the expense of the community member.
Well, let's extract some positives. So off of that, and she also holds up young people and academic achievement.
Oh yeah.
One of the things the Madison Rotary did, because for that brief moment of awkwardness with Alex G, I think they are trying, like so many of us.
I agree.
But what impressed me in the 10 years or so I've been involved is that there are a couple of different acknowledgments of academic achievement. One is the traditional valedictorian model, the folks with the highest GPA, but there is also a special day when people who are most improved have a chance to come to the stage, and that is a group of people who are immigrants, young people who didn't speak English when they were in junior high and somehow were able to adapt and to learn and then eventually to excel, but had to come a long way, or all of the things that happen because of the lowered expectations we have in communities of color. Again, kids that, like most kids, that kind of wandered off the path for a while but found their way back. We've got to really hold up those stories.
How can we not look at Avitops and the graduation rate of the Boys and Girls Club kids, and Achievement Connections, and the kids at the Urban League of Greater Madison, and not recognize that while the disparities, it does not diminish the disparities. It can't. Those are the numbers. They're real. They exist. But to me, it says we can be successful. This is still a small enough population that we can lift everybody up.
And where storytellers like Mullally come in, like yourself, like myself, I hope, is that we can reframe things that are important to the larger community in ways that are including people. The Nelson Institute, I was so proud of them. I was near tears because they opened with 2 panels on urban environmentalism. I can't remember her name, but she's a sociology professor at the UW who talked about her work in Detroit, again, on slow food justice issues. But she just made this distinction that we've got to undertake this work in not a way that, oh gosh, we have these solutions as white people coming in. No, we got to hold up the folks that are doing the good work on the ground in communities that may be struggling, but that are striving and trying in ways that we can never fathom.
Well, and isn't it Will Allen and people of color in Milwaukee and Detroit and others that are actually creating this urban agriculture movement that is transforming cities, and that reminds us of the role of the African American farmer in this country, historically, and the role that
many of those farmers. I mean, down in Selma, I thought that the story of the tent cities between Selma and Montgomery was connected to the march. No, it was people that were forced off the land, African American farmers, that because they got too uppity, the white establishment decided to push them aside. We've got to undo that. We've got to, capture that. African Americans are more likely to have an affinity for things rural and agricultural and food and all the things that are embodied in their culture, than most of us. So let's embrace that fact. Well, so just to come back to the Nelson Institute, though, again, I think there are so many positive models, but I think they kind of exist in isolated pockets. So much of the struggle that we face as journalists is connecting the dots, shining a light on those things, and then making people kind of strip away their stereotypes, see the possibilities. The environmental movement, by and large, was a pretty white movement. And again, I think it was urban people kind of embracing the promise of nature and everything. But where it's taken off is, again, seeing that environmentalism is a function of city life, embracing the axioms that are part of Native American culture. And Patty Lowe was talking about, the same people who were facing each other down in the treaty rights struggle of the 80s are now allies because white majority culture is understanding there are lots of things we have in common about our love for the land with Native Americans.
Yep, 7 generations is beginning to get some hold, much the way slow food is in terms of how we think about things. And you know, that relationship between food and slow food as an institution and the environmental movement is also very real, because globally around, you know, the various indigenous communities who care very much about preserving their culture and preserving the foods that are such a part of that culture are intimately aware of the threat of climate change and the destabilizing influence that climate issues and environmental issues have in their communities, right to the heart of their communities, with food being you know, a big part of it. And so I do think that the environmental movement now today, maybe as envisioned by Gaylord Nelson, is diverse in the truest sense of the word. Maybe not in this country, which tended to be more white support for it. Whites were worried.
There are a lot of social movements that have that problem.
Whites could afford to be more worried about recycling, you know. But around the world, it is really diverse.
And it's but it is changing, and I think that's positive. And these
changing
urban
in the United States.
In the United States, these urban food movements, again, bringing in Native American folks. You know, it's part of a larger indigenous peoples movement worldwide. We did a radio show on that last year. I was just amazed at what's happening. And it's also a notion of breaking down borders. So Native American people our borders are kind of arbitrary.
Yeah.
And relationship to the land is not about, you know, how many acres you own.
Can I just take the opportunity to say I'm so excited that the new editor of Madison Magazine.
I was leading into that, so I'm glad you bring that up.
Karen Lincoln Michelle is Ho-Chunk, and already, you know, we were talking about where that change begins and how we can aspire to some of the things that Mullally does, you know, regularly in her magazine. Having someone like Karen in the building is huge.
And Karen's background in part was with the organization Unity. There are groups for different ethnic minority groups, for the LGBT community, all kind of are under this umbrella.
She was president of Unity one year, which is
pretty impressive.
Big deal.
Yeah.
She also worked at the Green Bay Press Gazette. She worked for Gannett newspaper. She worked in Lafayette, Louisiana. She has a lot of experience.
Dallas Morning News. I think she worked with my friend Brooks Edgerton down there, so I want to connect with her at some point and compare experiences.
Yeah, she'd be a great guest.
She would be. Well, just reading about when she took the job in Lafayette, Louisiana, too, just, you know, realizing how important it is to put people of color, people from diverse communities in those positions. I want to come back to that as we wrap up in a few minutes here, but you know, one thread I don't want to lose here. Of course, this is what we're talking about are all Native American values, but again, you know, in embracing diverse cultures, and sometimes, unfortunately, those of us maybe more Northwest European stock, again, homogeneity and a notion of normal and all these other stuff that prevents us from getting at our roots and the fact that we are not just Americans, but we have this cultural diversity that's part of the mix. But the notion of thinking ahead, you know, I think the other thing sometimes majority culture, we think in the moment. So when Tony Robinson dies, well, that's just about Tony Robinson. We got to wait the 6 months until the case plays itself out or whatever. It's not an ahistorical event that resonates with people, that resonates in the past, and it resonates with people's hopes for the future. Where I'm going with this is thinking back to King Day. Diane Nash, who was involved with the Nashville lunch counters under Jim Lawson, who was in India with my mom, by the way. And the thing that she said that still just is burned in my mind in the best sense is when we were doing the work we were doing in the 1960s, we were working for generations yet unborn. What else sums up the sea change that has to happen around global climate change, around all racial justice, all the things that we have to do? We somehow got to think what it's going to be like for our children and our grandchildren and beyond.
Yeah, which I think informs, again, Superintendent Cheatham's desire to have us think about the role of public schools and what those children need to know and what preparation they need to be successful in the world that you're envisioning.
Absolutely. We've got about 5 minutes, so one quick observation. So you're a newsroom. I think you guys set the bar pretty high. You are really striving. You know, folks like Katie Sy and recently Dina Wright, and other folks who inform the conversation. I had breakfast with Shauna Rowan recently, who was one of the few African Americans in Madison newspapers. Yeah. It isn't just a matter of tokenism or anything. It really does make a difference to have diverse perspectives in the newsroom, doesn't it?
It does. There's no substitute for it. I mean, you just simply can't expect an all-white newsroom to have the nuance, the subtlety, to recognize maybe John, sometimes not so subtle or nuanced,
right? But
to recognize the more egregious sort of omission, even more than an error, and to have a diverse newsroom. Not only does it make for a richer breadth of coverage, but for a more inclusive coverage.
In the LGBT realm, having Brooks Edgerton at the Cap Times, Grace Daly at the State Journal, she changed the culture of those organizations. They both did.
Sure. And we need that in all of our workplaces. Right. It's important in the media for many of the obvious reasons. But as it happens more in our business community, it's going to help create a climate where there are more people willing to come and take a chance doing it in the media, which is something that we're constantly struggling with.
So with about 3 minutes left.
Yep.
An important transition is happening at your workplace. A gentleman who's been there for ages is about to go on to other things. So Tom Beaver, we met maybe about 12 years ago in an outreach dinner, and it wasn't quite that long ago. We were honoring Lee Sherman Dreyfus, who happened to be the former governor, who happened to be his comm arts professor, and that was a cool connection. So Tom and I continue to have lunch. Tom, I think, has been instrumental in the careers of so many people that I care about. Yourself, my friend Don Katie, so many other people we've brought along. He marked the passing of this era. What is it for you that Tom has done to you?
Well, first of all, it's been a privilege to work for Tom. And Tom is one of the most respected journalists in the United States.
He won an ethics award a few years ago.
He was the first winner of the UW School of Journalism Ethics Award, #1, well-deserved. As I mentioned, he served as president of the Radio and Television News Directors Association, and from that point on was just a very much loved and respected person in the industry. But it's a privilege to work at a family-owned station, John. I mean, Liz Burns,
which is an anomaly
her dad
these days.
started
Usually concentration of media ownership,
and Liz's loyalty to Tom, Tom's loyalty to Liz couldn't happen, I think, in a different environment. So in a way, it's Tom's role was supported and encouraged by our ownership, but he
acknowledges that.
But he also has very special qualities. He's an incredibly fair, kind, and an ethical man who ran a good department, who cared about his employees and their families and the community that we serve, and he was constantly pressing us to do more.
So you got to help me. You got to help me get him back into this chair, and perhaps you can sit there and do honor to him. We did just about a minute and a half left, though. Maybe a little less. I know you have to do this for the record. Give somebody 30 seconds to say something. What's your vision for where we're moving, where journalism needs to go, where the power of the storyteller can be realized in our society? Yeah,
I'm optimistic. I see the young people coming into schools of journalism, and they continue to come into schools of journalism. They see the journalism of the future.
Despite the stark realities
they're going to create the new journalism of the future.
Exactly.
It's going to be the hybrid of the digital.
We're missing that. We're assuming that we're on the decline, but I think we're coming up out of the valley.
Yep. I mean, I like what newspapers are doing. I like what magazines are doing, and the online broadcast television isn't going away anytime soon. And neither is cable.
It's morphing. It's evolving. New possibilities ahead.
Yeah.
You optimistic for the future?
Yeah, I am. We have a lot of obstacles to overcome.
Right.
I get worn down by politics sometimes, and the racial stuff is hard. The diversity stuff is hard. It's just hard. But I see so many good people working so hard at it, and such good hearts.
Yeah.
I mean, think of all the people that.
No question.
Really, really good hearts.
That's what keeps me here. That's what keeps me going.
Yeah, and I do think that Madison still, I mean, it has, and it can create even more of an environment to encourage this kind of creative, innovative, inclusive thinking that could be very healthy.
Let's have you back soon and explore those themes. Hey, remember, you also promised that I get to come over your way sometime soon. So
Will do, John.
We'll do that soon.
Thank you.
Neil Heinen, thank you so much for joining us. What a great pleasure. This has been Forward Forum. Forward Forum Show at AOL.com, or excuse me, Forward Forum Show at gmail.com is a place where you can write to us or contact us here by phone or email at the Sun Prairie Media Center. Thanks for joining us and have a great week.